This is the EnT podcast, conversations about education, technology, and culture, with Dr. Doug Reed and Dr. Matt Stranick. Thank you for joining us.
My name is Dr. Doug Reed, and I am located on Abagway, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
My name is Dr. Matthew Stranick, and I am located in Menakwisk in St. John, New Brunswick, which is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik Maliseet people. Welcome, one and all, to the final EdNonTech podcast episode for this year, 2025. Wow. It's been a heck of a year. Lots of goings on, lots of things that didn't happen, and I suppose, mathematically speaking, even more things that didn't happen. Notable in any which way you look at it. With me as ever, Dr. Doug Reed, the inestimable. I am Matt Stranick. We are glad to see you, and thanks a lot for joining us. Doug, how are you doing this final weekend before the holiday proper?
I'm doing really well. Yesterday, I couldn't be here, so I apologize for that. That was unexpected. So we're doing the recording today on the solstice, 2 days before Festivus, or Tibbs Eve if you're from Newfoundland and Labrador. So it's the festive season. So I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of goings on in terms of the calendar, in terms of how people kind of mark things historically. This is a pretty major space in our collective consciousness across the various epochs of human events and perhaps even cosmological events, which we may get into a bit here because science is pretty interesting, I got to say, and the movement of earth and heavenly bodies and the like. This is the equinox episode, as Dr. Doug has alluded to. I'm actually traveling just a few hours from now. I'm going across from one end of the North American continent to the other, from eastern Canada to the very farthest reaches of interior BC to visit my kids for the holiday week. And somehow that's in keeping, I think, with the mandate of the holiday and the equinox as a phenomenon, generally speaking. The shortest day in terms of daylight hours, but not necessarily the shortest day in terms of rotational time, which I was not aware of until I had done some Google searching yesterday and kind of went down a rabbit hole. Anyway, we may get into that. It's properly addressed in my share of the notes if we don't mention it later on. But yeah, daylight hours and the length of the day per se are not necessarily the same phenomena, which may be obvious to some people, but it wasn't obvious to me. So happy equinox, one and all, is what I'm trying to get at here. And happy Festivus. Doug, you knocked it out of the park with this topic. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Last episode, you and I had a conversation, and you told me about that little Festivus Easter egg you've got on our webpage. And so that was sitting on my head because I hadn't really noticed it. Like I read it. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a great turn of phrase, right? Isn't that nice, right? But I know you're good at that stuff. So it's like, oh, okay, that came from Matt. That's cool. And then I had a long week. If you know the way some weeks are longer than other weeks, well, I had a long week. And so I thought, what can I do? And I was just in a mood to air some grievances. So I started this episode as airing of grievances. And then I was like, no, I'm happy though. Why am I doing this? And then it tied together that we could grab other Festivus activities and put them together, because there's not just the airing of grievances of Festivus, there's also feats of strength, and there's also Festivus miracles. So what I did is I changed what I was doing, and so the topic is Festivus, EdTech for the rest of us, which again, thank you for that. And I took the same articles, and it's something in the EdTech literature that drives me bonkers that I am going to air some grievances about. And normally I take articles and I start chronologically and we go from point A to point B and talk about whatever the topic is. This time I took 3 articles and I did the airing of grievances on 3 articles. Then I took those same articles and did feats of strength. So it's part of it is I was reading some other literature, like not in our discipline, and they got to the point. The other literature, like other disciplines, they start and say, we did this, here's what happened, here's what we think, right? Like just to lay it out. And then tech stuff, well, here's some good stuff, and here's some bad stuff. And it's like, stop being so wishy-washy. Make your damn point. Right? Why are you trying to appease everybody? Right? That's not what we're here for. So anyway, that's kind of where I was the other day.
Awesome.
So that's why the format's slightly different for the notes and what I've handed you. So
variations on the format are always welcome in the Ed Non-Tech podcast, and the Festivus spirit runs high in the presentation as well as the content with this, I gotta say. So well done on that front.
thanks.
Festivus means something different to each of us, as it turns out. That's one of the lessons of Festivus, folks. There's going to be more, you betcha. And in case anyone needs just a little smidgen more clarity on the Easter egg, the Festivus Easter egg, which Doug alluded to, if you visit our website, analogtrope.ca/podcast, you will see at the very sort of top right of the page, there's a little widget with a little bracket, a little bracketed quote, Ed Tech for the rest of us. Well, George Costanza's dad and Kramer, when they're reviving Festivus, when they strike upon the idea of that on that very iconic episode of Seinfeld, the series from the 90s, the elder Costanza, George Costanza's dad, played brilliantly by the late Jerry Stiller actor, brilliant actor, who's among his many roles, this is kind of the one he's noted for because Seinfeld was such a high profile show. He says that he had a vision of a Festivus for the rest of us, and that just made me giggle. It still makes me giggle. And so I thought, Ed Tech for the rest of us, that kind of fills the same kind of spirit of the show that we're maybe aspiring for. And it's something that I think has a nice little lilt to it in terms of a language piece. And so it's just been sitting there since pretty much the main website was built long these past 3.5 years ago. So anyway, in case anybody wants a little bit of background, do make sure you get yourselves to the website as well, I suppose is what I'm saying there. Now, Doug, in keeping with the variation on the format, this particular set of notes actually begins with a set of images. We normally have the images placed kind of, you see them on the notes because what I do with them, I strategically space them out around the references. But in terms of what Doug provides in the Google document, and in terms of how we discuss the content of the Google document in the show, we normally speak to the references and then get into the visuals a bit. In this case, there's some very prominent visuals here starting out at the beginning of the notes. So, Doug, why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. Because we're into Festivus and that we're having a bit of fun with it, there's 5 key components that most people know about Festivus, right? I've already mentioned a couple, like feats of strength, airing of grievances, Festivus miracles. There's also a Festivus dinner, and the 5th one is the Festivus pole. And the Festivus pole is supposed to be a rejection of commercialism. And just here's your pole, and that's it. Or at least I've heard it explained that the Festivus pole and the whole Festivus concept is a rejection of commercialism and what Christmas and Xmas have become. So I went online, I'm digging around, and people are selling Festivus pole packages, which I find just so funny. It pleased me so much. So I've included a couple of pictures. One is somebody's homemade Festivus pole, and another is the packaging and the 9-inch Festivus pole and all kinds of other Jerry Stiller, Seinfeld logoed stuff. It's just, there it is. I needed to include it. I could not figure out how to turn literature into something I could connect to the Festivus pole concept. So I just threw the pictures in there and said, we're done here. Moving on. So I hope you're cool with that, because I enjoyed doing it. I thought it was fun.
I'm personally more than cool with it. I'm delighted with it, and kind of seeking metaphor, as I tend to do as an English teacher and writer kind of guy. My thinking immediately goes to, wow, aluminum poles as a metaphor for educational technology and vendor finagling on that enterprise altogether is absolutely a gift wrap metaphor, if you will. So, in terms
Yeah.
of the themes of the show, I even made some kind of passing reference to it in the notes as to metal poles being sacrificed to the ed tech endeavor. So, again, folks, you really want to check the notes for this show more perhaps than any show that we've done, I don't know, recently, although I'm pretty proud of all of them, quite frankly. This one just lands a little bit more, particularly if you're checking this out in the holiday period. Shouldn't assume that you are, but hopefully you might be.
Now, one thing I connected with the Festivus pole is the homemade Festivus pole is what, almost 2 meters, 6 feet, whatever it is, and it's nice and tall. And then you go to the commercialized one, which is 9 inches. So what's that? 20 centimeters. And it's just, imagine that the one people made at home is so much bigger and so much more prominent than the one you're paying for because it's got pretty packaging. And doesn't that talk about how ed tech kind of works? With as soon as the corporates take over, and we'll get back to that because I found out some interesting stuff about that later on. But it's just the what do you want? Do you want the big one or do you want the little one? Because you're probably paying a lot more for the little one, because I know how much the materials cost for the big one, but I don't know how much the marketing and all the other intellectual property costs are for the little one. Anyway, that just made me chuckle. So, and when I saw it, it was like, no, it has to go in.
We could even take that as far as self-hosted open source solutions versus bespoke, hosted, highly slick, highly customized products marketed by technology companies. You want to get into Moodle versus other kinds of LMS, we can go there. We might not. Lots of places to go with that. Absolutely, as it turns out, eloquent Festivus visual metaphor. So thank you for that, Doug.
You're welcome.
Now, as Doug has alluded to, in the notes, we have it broken down by Festivus themes, if you will. The first, and I think maybe the one that folks familiar with the iconic, absolutely iconic episode from the Seinfeld series from the 90s might be aware of, might think of, first off, would be the airing of grievances. And in our first reference here, as per Doug's historical tendencies, we're going all the way back to 1969 with Selden and Barman. And that's the first of several references under the airing of grievances. Doug, why don't you tell us about this quote and why you chose it?
Sure. I started with airing of grievances, the whole concept, because that's where I thought this whole episode was going to go. That's the only reason it's first. There's no other reason for that. And I was in a bit of a gripey mood. So this article, Seldwin et al., most teachers tend to regard educational technology devices with deep suspicion. That has not changed. I look at what we have now, like, oh, here's the laptop trolley. Oh, right, here's the iPad trolley, right? Or let's book the computer lab, or here's the latest app that you got to put on your phone, right? I do not think the deep suspicion has changed. I honestly believe that is still there. Because teachers, according to this article and my beliefs as well, teachers think that education as a more or less personal relationship between them and their students. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And then they talk about how programmed materials, canned electronic lessons, learner operated machines, even older audiovisual aids tend to interfere with the generally parental interest teachers have in the success of their students. Hence, resistance to these devices amongst teachers is high. They saw the technology of getting in the way of what really mattered, which was the relationship. And I am sure we have talked about that on previous episodes.
100%.
And we're on the same page with that. And it's okay, this is 56 years later. That hasn't changed. And so what are we doing about it? Because the airing of the grievances, what are we doing about it? The suspicion hasn't changed. So in more than 55 years, we have the same issue. What have we done to address it other than diddly squat? So my first grievance is diddly squat's not good enough. And we both have terminal degrees in that field. How much of your life has been spent showing people how to use some of the technology, saying, no, it'll be good for you, it'll help? You must have had that sort of conversation on more than one occasion.
Kind of a key function of a role that I was involved in for 4 years anyway. But as it turns out, the career moves on. And thinking of Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher from, I don't know, good 3,000 years ago anyway, his quote always kind of comes to mind. It's something I thought of a lot this year when I first really began meditating on his metaphor. It was referenced more than once by Marcus Aurelius in his meditations, which I've really come to appreciate over the life of the show. And Heraclitus, one of his famous metaphors, basically is that time is like a river and that you're never the same person twice when you step into it because you're a different person and the composition of the river itself is different. And so I think of that as being kind of an essential part of the human experience. And I also think that you could switch out time as a river to technology is its own kind of river. It changes, it always shifts. The product, the platform may be similar, but the configuration, the human circumstances surrounding the implementation is always different. And for me, 4 years rather, was at this point, about 4 years ago, I've been gone from that role pretty much as long as I was there. And pretty soon that whole period will be further downstream. So to speak to those interactions, I definitely think of them as formative. But to be honest with you, I worked at a call center, an inbound call center in Fredericton for 4.5 years, right? And I was talking about car rental reservations as opposed to, say, the operation of Moodle. And my role in that capacity was way more tightly focused. So I can kind of juxtapose your point across and over to the customer service setting that I was involved in, because quite frankly, I spent more hours doing that than I did in the quote unquote EnT support role as specific. So thanks for the opportunity to speak to that a bit, Doug.
No problem, because I'm going to use your exact same story and tie it to this next article. Because
Fantastic.
part of what you talked about is when you moved it from one context to another. Well, I'm jumping ahead to 2021 in this next article. It's Crazy You, Avdu, and Avdu, and it's examining teachers, administrators, and parents' view on the drawbacks of technology use in education. So we've jumped ahead more than 50 years, and what they've got to say is the majority of participants believe that the use of computer technology in the classroom is distracting, reduces social interaction, is responsible for the development of a loneliness. It can be addictive, it's expensive, it bears a risk, is remarkably easy to copy and reproduce, and even undermines a teacher. So, 55 years later, we are not doing better. So what did we not do in the 60s? Well, we're still not doing it now. So we're just seeing the same messages over and over and over, and we haven't changed our approach in any meaningful matter, because if anything, it's worse than it was. And so, again, I'm airing a grievance. I am annoyed at things. And part of what shocked me, I didn't include these articles in this, but when I went back and looked, and I started taking a look at like drawbacks and EdTech, when I was searching for those kind of phrases, all the early literature is economic. All the early literature was something that could be measured. It was, here's how much it's going to cost. And it was about money. It wasn't about students, and it wasn't about learning outcomes. It wasn't about the curriculum. It wasn't about teachers. It was about money and the costs. And it's like, wow, I always thought that the money people and the big corporations that have kind of tried to seize the name of EdTech did that later. And they didn't. They were in there right at the beginning. So it's interesting that I've had to adjust my view. And I like the adjusting my view part, because as I find more information, I change what I think. So when you're looking at that, like, is there the canned electronic lessons, learner operated machines, the loneliness component? That strikes me as very real. And that strikes me why teachers are resistant to it. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think you spoke very eloquently to the issues that are raised within the article. It kind of brought me back to my doctoral training at University of Calgary, where among our very small cohort of students, we really came to hit on the phrase pedagogy before technology as something which we wanted to aspire to in our kind of higher level investigations in the area. And we were fortunate to work with some pretty solid instructors, pretty solid academics at the time, among them Dr. Randy Garrison of the Community of Inquiry. He and his colleagues developed and built that out over 20, 25 years of research, a lot of research studies. And his point with us, one of the things he said was, we're not training you in this program to be the people who are the multimedia technicians. You're not going to be the IT operators. You're going to be the people who are investigating the usage of this stuff and investigating associated practice. And the term investigation was always, again, part of the conceptual and practical mix within that cohort, where before you roll something out with students or any other user group, I suppose, it's really helpful to know how and why you're doing it and to have appropriate training and support in place so that you can use the full capabilities of the format, the technology in question, and really capitalize on it as an educational piece rather than having to kind of deal with these detrimental elements which are referred to by the authors. So just in terms of where this brings me from and to, in terms of my experience, I'm thinking of a sweaty, small seminar room on the University of Calgary campus in the Education Tower circa the summer of 2012 for that. So thank you, Doug.
You're welcome, because that ties nicely into the third airing of grievance article, Nikolic, Panovic, and Gojgic, Educational Technology Benefits and Drawbacks. And they do the typical thing. Oh, EdTech has numerous advantages. And then they leave it. And then it's, here's some problems. Right away, it's be the kind, oh yeah, it's nice, but. And one of them is adaptability. They identify like technological changes are faster than the willingness and capacity of teachers to accept the changes. And it's like, yeah, I wouldn't agree. So why are we forcing teachers onto this never-ending treadmill? Why? And one of the images later on kind of refers to the never-ending treadmill. Another one is outdated educational systems. Schools do not have the latest and greatest. You are using retro systems most of the time, right? I remember when I was a K-12 teacher, there was we could go to the government. The government would have these auctions, and they would sell off like pallets of computers. They would take old government computers that were out of date, wrap them in that plastic wrap, and just deliver a pallet with like 30 computers on it. And we felt so happy because we put a bid in and got them. And then it was like, oh, great. Be careful what you wish for, because they were outdated. What do? None of them were the same, right? The networking of them was a nightmare. Like the software was sketchy to non-existent, but we had them. They were in a room, and how do we figure that out? And it's not like we had text. It was figured out how to do it. But the key one from Nikolic et al., like 2024, they bring up false education, false information. And now that's something we never had to deal with before. The amount of fake news and the amount of just lies and disinformation that's being pumped out across the world is crazy. In a way that 20, 25, 30 years ago, information might have been wrong. Now it's purposefully wrong. And I see that as just a disaster. So now, like in Finland, there's courses, like every student has to take a course, like every year, on information literacy, on how do we know if this information is right or not. And that also ties into AI. The latest stuff I've read, everybody seems to be calling AI output slop now. That AI slop. And it's the false information that we never got into. Like even in 2021, false information wasn't a big deal. But now it's everywhere. Now everybody's finally seen it. The emperor has no clothes. Let's call it for what it is and figure out how to deal with it. And I feel bad for educators that are in the classrooms trying to do that right now. Because what we've been doing for 55 years hasn't worked well enough. There's got to be a better way. So that's my third grievance that I've aired.
Well, that's fantastic, Doug. And you've really placed a lot of eloquent metaphors into there. I was reminded as you were speaking of a little nugget from Rolling Stone magazine, of all places, that I saw on my Facebook feed, where it talked about how AI, one of its disingenuous, dishonest uses is that it's being used to create essentially fake, entire fake academic articles, which then are getting indexed and cited by quote unquote human, actual, real practicing scholars, and how that's one of the many ways that academia is losing credibility among the general public, which it's always had a problem with it. And if you throw in the viral disinformation capacity that AI tends to provide, then it's even more so. And the emperor has no clothes. I mean, that's just a really good way of putting it, Doug. I thought in those terms. So that's kind of one area I personally had to around this time last year, actually, when I was practicing at an institution in Alberta, where I had a large number of students who really were leaning into the use of generative AI for their academic work in my classes. And I was involved in prosecuting something like 30 or 40 cases of academic integrity non-compliance in the course of one semester. And the institutional response, even to that, was not even that supportive, in as much as I'm not working there anymore. I could have been, but I'm not, right? I was laid off, but then they advertised for my position again later, and I just didn't get the call for it. So I have to think that that may have been a factor relative to that. So it's an endemic aspect of where we're at now. Certainly, since the life of this show, 3.5 years ago at this point, folks, for those keeping track at home, we've seen this capacity for disinformation just increase rapidly, exponentially. And the last thing I'll speak to this is it undermines the creativity aspect. It makes those muscles in students and educators weaker, because when you are no longer required to create something, right? In Bloom's taxonomy, create something. It's like the highest level of achievement in the taxonomy. And it's like, well, I can just get a pre-existing or customized AI output from that, from a large language model, which just generates this stuff from existing content. And folks, for those who are checking this out, you'll notice there's musical clips, which are part of the intro and outro of the show. Well, I go to a website called pixabay.com, source of images, source of lots of different content. I go there specifically for the music. And in the musical selections now, they got a little robot icon to indicate AI generated musical clips. And I purposefully avoid using those clips. I'm going to go with something that was created by a human creator as opposed to an AI bot. And I've noticed just over the past year that if you are just scrolling through the lists of 10 or 15 or 20 different clips you can choose from. It's gotten to the point where only a couple of them don't have that little robot icon. So to speak to the slop factor that Doug was speaking to a little bit ago, that's just one small example. And so I'm using my very limited purview here to support human creativity outside the capacity of these automated AI systems.
Yeah, along those lines, I think AI is something that is being done to us. I do not believe it's helping. I honestly believe it's a way to take people that don't have any skills in a certain thing and give them a quick, easy solution instead of letting us, like, can you imagine? I want the machines to like clean my house. I'm not interested in machines to make my art and make my music. Like that's not what I want. So I think it's being done to us, and we've already done about 7 episodes on generative AI. I'm sure more are coming because that's the world we live in right now. But what I want to do is turn the page and go to feats of strength. I want to go to some more happy stuff. And what I've done is we're going back to Solomon and Barrowman from 1969. And here's some feats of strength. Here's some happiness. Here's some successes. Here's some good things or more positive things than the airing of grievances. One of the comments is, I believe that technology, if used as proper means to worthy ends, so they got that disclaimer in there, has the potential for increasing the productivity of our enterprise. And in this case, their enterprise is education. It's how do we help? And then they talk about how new media provides a variety of new educational roles. And that includes teacher and supportive personnel, increased specializations in the profession, and changes to like the school tables of organization. So a whole bunch of 1960s words for what has happened. So these two back in the 60s, they got it right. They nailed it. It's because I've done a whole pile of those roles. I wasn't just a classroom teacher. I did the other things too. I'm doing one of the other things right now. And it talks about how some of these roles, like scriptwriter, they didn't get right, but planner they did. That's called instructional designer now, honestly. They'll be ancillary to the more basic jobs of instruction. And 100% that has happened across every school district and every post-secondary I've had any dealings with. So I just love the fact that, yep, they said, here's what's coming, and they were bang on. So these two got it right.
Absolutely. And really what motivated me to join this area pretty early on in my career, right? I got my B.Ed back in 2008 is when I graduated from that program. And by 2012, I was enrolled in the doctoral program because at that point I was in my 30s and I felt like I had some catching up to do. But I was motivated within that period to specialize in the curriculum, instructional design, and ultimately e-learning spaces because I really felt that those areas had a lot of potential to elevate learning and to make learning bespoke, customized, more widely available, more accessible to more people. I was very optimistic about the potential. And as far as it goes, I tend to remain so. I can't get up every day and be motivated by something negative, even if my career at times kind of goes through some turbulent periods and whatnot. I can separate my personal narrative from what led me into the field. And I still see that educational technology done right has a lot of really strong potential to enhance creativity, to make education more accessible to more people, and really a lot of affordances, I suppose, relative to the many challenges which we were talking about just a moment ago.
And that leads us perfectly to the second feats of strength by coming back to Kriezu, Abdu, and Abdu. They talk about the majority of teachers, administrators, parents indicate that technology effects, enhances the contemporary teaching and should be used by teachers in all subjects, not just one subject, not just two, but all of them. And people have a positive attitude towards the use of technology. And they talk about how it improves student motivation and interest into subjects. And integrating technology helps with lengths of attention spans. So there's all of these positives that go along with, and this is the same article that had some unpleasant things to say about technology just 10 minutes ago. So it is also the distraction. It also reduces social interaction. They're like, no, we got to use it. Here's the positives. It's got to happen. It's got to happen. So we're getting conflicting information from them. And that is so typical of the tech stuff. But there is an upside. It wasn't just a negative article. And there's so many good things. And that's why we can do this sort of stuff. Because for me, when I got into ed tech, it was because my classroom was across the hall from the new computer lab. And I was comfortable with computers. And then people would just come to my class and interrupt and say, hey, I can't get such and such to work. So I would zip across and do whatever and come back. They would think I was a genius. So that felt good. But after you've done something 20 or 30 times, it's really simple. It's like, oh, yeah, you got to go in and do this and click this and make sure you go to that window and whatever. So that's how I got in. And I'm wondering if you have a comment on like the switch with this article where it goes from, oh, no, it causes distractions, this and that. Oh, no, but you got to use it. I'm wondering if you have any insights into anything they brought up.
Yeah, I found, first of all, what you spoke to about your earlier career experience as helping elevate your community of practice, essentially, right? Your fellow educators. That was something where within sort of that 4-year window that I kind of described, I had the experience of using these wiki websites, PB Wiki, as a
Yep.
way of enhancing my course delivery sort of outside of our institution's LMS capability, which at that point was actually formative, non-existent, really. And so it was something where I began using these wikis because they were something that I found within my BEd little 3-month module on instructional design that I thought, okay, this could have some potential because, like you, I was comfortable with the capabilities of computers, the internet at that point, relative to other folks, I suppose. And it turned into something that had a lot of far reaching effects for the people around me. And that being able to assist other people in my local context, my institution, really was a strong motivator for me to investigate the whole area further. And as you mentioned, the critical areas that are identified by the authors compared to these more, I guess, optimistic kind of places, that I think really speaks to something we've talked about throughout the life of the show. The context really is everything. That your local spot for implementation, your local students, your local fellow educators are all key. They're all very specific to the situation in terms of how you approach this stuff. In my current setting, I'm kind of working in a quote unquote special education capacity. And there's one student who I encountered, nonverbal, very intelligent, very perceptive person, but they rely on a tablet for some of their communication, a tablet that's loaded with software and an interface that they are very comfortable with. And this child, as I say, nonverbal, indicated through the tablet very clearly that they wanted to go to the playground, whereas that's something that they would not have been able to do with their verbal capability. And that was something that in my practice, I just hadn't encountered it thus far. So I'm always finding things in my local context where it's like, okay, there's something here which, if done purposefully, if done mindfully, can elevate in meaningful ways the lives of people in whatever way. So that's my most recent example, I suppose.
And that's a nice example of the Nikolic et al. Article when I come back to the third one for the feats of strength, because they talk about the
Fantastic.
structure of the learning environment is adjusted to suit the student's needs. And you just perfectly described a learning environment that was adjusted to the student's needs
Yeah.
because their device worked. It told you what they needed, the communication could happen. So that's fantastic, right? Because that's talking about different forms of interactivity. That's just so wonderful. Thank you for just guiding that in so nicely. That really worked well. And the teaching process is focused on the students, right? It's not necessarily about the content. It is about the students. And students are also encouraged to not just receive information, but to think critically about it and independently work. And yeah, if that child wanted to go outside, they made it clear what they wanted. So I just love the way you tied that feat of strength in for me. And this article also had a diagram that I wasn't in love with.
It's an awesome diagram, though. It's very effective for communicating its point, I think. I can see what may you find fault with it, but I'm glad you threw it in there, Doug.
Yes, and I threw it in because depending what the diagram's job was, if it was to attract my attention, absolutely, it worked. But as I got in, I started to analyze it as if it was like a theoretical framework, a piece of research. And I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And then it's like, no, hold on. Don't be a ding dong. Don't dig too deep. That's not what we're doing. Right? It did its job. It attracted my attention and made me look. And it made me focus on the dot points that came with it. So it's student in focus in the teaching process is the title. I hate it, but it worked. So that's on me. It's one of those things, right? It's like you can not like something, but appreciate that it did its job.
Only in as much as it causes you to go through critical evaluation, make some choices, and arrive at the determination that it's not really your thing, that process itself is pretty valuable. Speaking to the Stoic notion of where there's the challenge is the way forward, right? So
yes.
to find something that you don't necessarily care for, just figuring out that you don't care for it can itself be a pretty key aspect of critical discernment, which is definitely a vital part of any kind of educational endeavor.
And for me, this was part of its feat of strength. It forced me to engage exactly that way. It forced me to say, why don't I like this? And then that got me to dig in. And it's like, oh man, it's like the trap was right there. And I stepped right in it. So I didn't like it, but it did all the things. And it's like, that annoyed me a little bit, but I begrudgingly gave respect to the authors for doing it. if that makes any sense.
That's
yeah,
very much in keeping with the Festivus spirit, I suppose.
yeah.
It's aesthetically challenging, maybe. It's conceptually or intellectually kind of gnarly, but at the end of the day, it's recognizing the spirit of the endeavor dressed up differently than what you might prefer, but undeniably, there it is, like a giant pole in the center of the room, observing the feats of strength taking place and the airing of grievances surrounding it.
Yes, and in the original episode of Seinfeld, feats of strength ended the Festivus celebration. But what would have to happen is you have to do some kind of Greco-Roman wrestling with the host, and until the host was pinned or lost, Festivus wasn't over. So it was wrapping up that image, that diagram was that for me. It's like, yeah, it beat me. It beat me. It did everything right, and I still didn't like it. So that forced me to do the thinking. But anyway, I want to jump to Festivus Miracles. So I have 2 other articles because normally I have 4 or 5. So we've repeated those other 3 twice. And now we have a Kiesling in 1970 on the economic analysis of EdTech. And this is what really twigged me to go in a different direction. And there's 2 quotes here. One is, there's no doubt that this technology will have a definite role in future instructional strategies. They were absolutely correct. When educators see something that will help students learn, they use it. They do. So that's part of the miracle. Even with the airing of grievances that we've shared earlier, we know it's a struggle, we know it's tough, but if there's a value to it, I'm willing to put the time and effort in to help my students. So that's, to me, that's part of the Festivus miracles, because that's just the way these things work. Then they start talking about the costs of computer assisted instruction. And they look at how much it's going to cost, and they disagree about what the future role would be. Like if it's a full-scale tutorial device or a full-scale tutorial program, that's very different than a simple drill device. And they were still looking at it at the mechanical device sections, and not software wasn't a thing yet. That the concept of software where you could have a device with more that could do more than one thing really wasn't there. So they were right on. They absolutely nailed it. They did so well. So they projected what was going to happen, and they've been right. It's 55 years later, and they are bang on. So good on them. That's my thought.
Absolutely. And I have to think that even in the time that's passed since I was involved in my doctoral work, I remember at one point that clickers were really kind of a thing, right? The
Yes.
student responses, like you give everybody a handset and you can engage with the PowerPoint quiz or whatever, or even in some cases, biometrics. One of the people in our cohort was a phys ed teacher, and they did a whole study about, I don't know if it was smartwatches, probably not smartwatches, but some other kind of measure, a physical hardware kind of measure of tracking students' engagement with the phys ed programming through a personal wearable device, right? So there's always going to be a niche for these kinds of physical systems that you mentioned. But yeah, I enjoy seeing the references here from a different era, but still dealing with contemporary issues.
And it splits it up. It's taking a look at, do we want this simple drill device, or do we want a full-scale tutorial program? I don't know if those conversations really happen anymore, or if we've just baked it all in together. right? It's like, yep, here's a whole bunch of computers we got from whatever vendor, and here's the LMS we're going to use, and here's the software we've agreed to have. So looking at it that way, I don't know if we've just industrialized it or we've just accepted, okay, here's the routine, here's what we do, here's how it is. Because how many of those other little devices, like the clickers, still exist, right? Everybody has a phone, so let's go to the clicker app instead. I don't know if there is a clicker app, but I know there's
Apps. I have to think that the educational app might be your simple drill device in this case, as opposed to the full scale LMS, because I think that as you get into certainly in post secondary, maybe not so much in K to 12, but when it comes to the bring your own device model, I mean, the notion of having the dedicated computer lab for students to access, I don't think is as much of a concept anymore. I don't think you see quite as much usage of the laptops issued to every student because it's sort of, we've reached a point where the devices themselves are pretty much ubiquitous. And so
yeah,
LMS tends to be very laptop centric, doesn't tend to really work very well on the smartphone. And yet, if you were to ask me at this point, probably I'd say I'd rather be without my laptop than my cell phone. I'm at that point because one of them would curtail my ability to just do things on a normal day-to-day level more so than the other. And I think probably then you could make the argument that that personal drill system, you basically turn your phone into a clicker. You basically turn the phone
yeah,
into your way of accessing or engaging with the system that's necessary in the classroom at the moment, with the administrative element kind of taking place at the back end off some secondary systems, some secondary devices. In the contemporary app kind of ecosystem that we tend to work in and live in these days.
and I didn't include this, but Jacob Nielsen with his user interface literature. We're gonna have to talk about that sometime because what you're describing to me is the move. Like what happened in Star Trek. In Star Trek, way back when, back in the '60s, every device did one thing. There was a lever that did this. These buttons did that, and then the big leap to the Star Trek: The Next Generation, where it was display panels and the displays could change, which is what's happened to us. Instead of things doing one thing and one thing only, be dedicated to the one thing, now the app changes all that. So you can't memorize, and the tactile feel involves needing to use your eyes. So people with poor vision are going to have a tougher time than with the new stuff than with the old stuff because it's like, okay, that thing did that. This thing did this. And it didn't change to be programmable to anything else. So yeah, we'll come back to that in another episode. It just thank you for bringing that up. That's striking for me. Final final article. Daniel West and McIntosh, 2007, exploring the roles in ICTs in addressing educational needs. And then they talk about myths and miracles, and they talk about the iron triangle. And this is another one of these economic ones where they talk. The iron triangle has three sides: access, quality, and cost. And they're talking about how EdTech addresses all three of those in a positive way. And it's like, cool. So the big miracle is that with economies of scale and consistency, the quality that can come with using media in education. So the miracle's there. It's happened. We've got our win because without, like, if we were trying to do a bespoke solution to everything in EdTech, the costs would be astronomical and it wouldn't have happened. There's just no way. You'd have little pockets of it here and there and in some rich places, but the mass rollout of how EdTech has happened just would not have happened. With the increasing quality and now with more increased access and the lower cost, it seems awesome. And I'm glad that Daniel et al. Have talked about that. And this was an article out of Africa. So we hit Europe, we hit North America, we hit Africa in this episode. So I was a little proud of that too.
Well, it's a great way to go out, and increased accessibility through online and other kinds of technologies is certainly a compelling aspect of what brought me into this area. I really appreciate the reference here from the so-called Global South, the Commonwealth of Learning, that very venerable organization that does a lot of really significant work. They're closely associated with Athabasca University, one of Canada's leading, if not Canada's specifically most well-known distance-based learning institution since the 1970s. It's something where some of the best presentations, some of the most memorable presentations, back when I used to go to conferences pretty often, I would go and specifically seek out these conference talks by people who were in these kinds of so-called global south kind of communities, and the fact that they could access these Commonwealth of Learning websites and resources and implement them to scale relative to, say, a dial-up internet connection or whatever other way. Those kind of approaches really struck me as being among the reasons to be optimistic about what we're even up to in this area. So really like that as a way to go out here, Doug. Really a positive, optimistic final reference, as far as I'm concerned, some quotes from it anyway, that can put us properly in the Festivus spirit in a good way.
Yes, thanks for that. And I have a couple of images that I've shared on the website, and they are eclectic. Normally, there's more of a focus to what I've shared, but this is just stuff that spoke to me this week, just with the week that I had. And there's one in particular that I really liked that was sitting in my digital clutter, and it's a social media post, and it starts with, "My professor scared me for a second." And the first comment from the professor is, "You have attachment issues. Please fix it." Then the second line is, "Sorry for the confusion. I meant the file attachment." And it just spoke to everybody's work in progress that seems to be so obvious for the year 2025, because this was a heck of a year. And as
Absolutely.
we wrap up, it just made me laugh. It's like, my professor scared me. I could be the person. I absolutely would write a message like, "You have attachment issues, please fix it." That would be exactly how I would do that.
Language means different things to different people under different circumstances, and the need for using terminology which has relatively equal meaning to both parties is essential, folks. So I enjoyed that one. I got a chuckle out of that as well when I was scrolling through the document. You can see these very images in this very self-same Camtasia clip, because we have the ability to do that in this 2025 year that we're wrapping up here. You'll also see them in the notes, so please be sure to visit the website and see them in a slightly different format than in the video, if you're even watching the video. I personally got a kick out of this graphic, which you referenced earlier, Doug, the person on the escalator to nowhere, the infinite scroll loop with the person kind of looking down at their phone with an unhappy expression, with the caption, "I'll hit bottom eventually," right? And boy, oh boy, it's not uncommon for me in the middle of the night to wake up I got sleep apnea, so every couple of hours I just kind of wake up and go, like, and I'll reach for my phone because my phone is beside the bed, unlike like a lot of people, I suppose. And just, okay, well, I'm awake for the next 10 minutes. Let's just see what's on Instagram or Facebook since 3 hours ago. And just, oh,
Yep.
yeah, doom scrolling at night, right? I think that image captures a lot of the contemporary user experience for folks in various ways in the general culture, or I dare say even in the educational area. So
Yeah, that's very fair. I put that in there for the very reasons that you described. So thanks for summing that up.
fantastic. So Doug, does that bring us to the word, question, and praise of the podcast?
It does. The word of the podcast is Festivus because that's what it was all about this week. And we know Festivus is in 2 days. So from the recording time, not from posting time. A question of the podcast. This is a little different because I wrote it for the other episode that I was going to look at, but I still think it fit here. And the question is, how can we show our EdTech resourcings help improve education? Because with the airing of grievances, we know that it doesn't. Not always. Now with the feats of strength, we know that it can, but it's how do we ensure? That's the key part. And I don't think that has been consistent in the last 50 odd years. Now, the phrase of the podcast, again, there's two of them. And mine was AI slop because, my goodness, there's a lot of slop out there that is not created by people. And the other one, the other phrase is yours. And it's so tidily summed everything up. It's before you roll out. And how many times across 4 seasons have we talked about, did the thought get put into this? Did we decide what we were aiming for before? And it was, let's do it right the first time. If you don't have time to do it twice, what are we doing? So before you roll out was so nicely phrased. And I know normally you use bigger words and make them more literature kind of structured in my head anyway. But before you roll out was just so to the point. It just tied everything up wonderfully for me. So that's what I got.
Well, fantastic. There you have it, folks. It's been, as Doug has said, a pretty significant 2025. Hopefully more to the good than to the challenging for you. But in any case, it is rapidly drawing to a close. On this very day of recording, we're looking at the fewest hours of daylight, at least in the northern hemisphere. And I am just a couple hours away from getting on an airplane from one side of this North American continent to the other. And so I'm prepared to end this episode on what I consider a high note. Appreciate you all for being here and definitely appreciate these conversations with Doug. I've enjoyed the endeavor, enjoyed episode or season 4 of the EdNonTech podcast, and looking forward to whatever 2026 has in store for any of us and for all of us, and especially for you, the listener. Thanks for being here.
And I hope you have a safe flight. I am going to go hop on a live feed and watch the winter equinox, winter solstice at Newgrange in Ireland, where they have cameras set up in that 4,500-year-old burial chamber, and the sun pokes its head in only once a year, only at the solstice. So I'm going to go do that, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday.
Fantastic. Take care, everybody, and bye for now.